The strangest thing about legends, Ethan Walker would later say, is that most of them are standing in line just like everyone else. The arrival terminal of Helios Prime shimmered beneath miles of transparent alloy, its curved ceiling glowing with the pale blue light of a nearby gas giant. Thousands of travelers flowed through the immigration hall every hour. Merchants pushed cargo cases across polished floors. Families gathered around information kiosks. Children pressed their faces against observation windows to watch starships drift through the docking lanes beyond. It was loud, crowded, and ordinary. That was exactly why nobody noticed the human at first. Ethan Walker stood in line with a worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His dark navy jacket looked years old. A few faint creases marked his weathered face. Light brown hair touched the collar of his coat. Nothing about him suggested importance. Nothing about him attracted attention. He simply waited his turn while the automated queue lights blinked overhead. Two travelers behind him argued about docking fees. Somewhere farther away, an infant cried. A maintenance drone hummed across the ceiling. The giant terminal continued moving with the rhythm of a living city. Then Ethan stepped forward. Passport Control Station 42. The alien woman behind the counter barely looked up at first. Her silver-blue skin reflected the glow of her workstation. Her delicate fingers moved across a holographic display as she processed another arrival. "Passport, please," she said automatically. Ethan handed over a small travel document. "Thank you." She scanned it. A green line swept across the page. Identity verification began. The woman glanced toward the screen. Then she froze. Her eyes narrowed. For a moment she appeared confused, as though she believed the system had made an error. She checked the document again. Then the screen. Then the document once more. The color slowly drained from her face. Her breathing changed. Around them, the terminal continued moving. Nobody noticed. Not yet. The officer swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled slightly above the console. Ethan recognized the reaction immediately. He closed his eyes for a brief second. Not again. The woman rose from her chair so quickly that it rolled backwards several feet. Nearby travelers turned their heads. A security officer looked over from across the hall. Silence spread outward like ripples across water. The immigration officer stood perfectly straight. Her eyes remained fixed on the name displayed before her. Ethan Walker. Then, to the complete shock of everyone watching, she placed a hand over her heart and lowered her head. Not a polite nod. Not a professional greeting. A deep bow. The kind reserved for royalty, heroes, and sacred figures. Conversations died instantly. The terminal fell silent. Hundreds of eyes shifted toward the human standing at Station 42. Ethan sighed softly. It sounded less like pride and more like exhaustion. "Please," he said quietly. "You really don't have to do that." But the woman did not raise her head. And for the first time that day, people throughout Helios Prime began asking the same question. Who was Ethan Walker? Ethan could feel the eyes before he looked up. Thousands of them. Curious eyes. Confused eyes. Nervous eyes. The silence hanging over Immigration Hall felt heavier than the gravity generators beneath the floor. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then the station alarms resumed their normal chime. Information screens continued scrolling departure schedules. Somewhere in the distance, a cargo shuttle announced final boarding. Life slowly returned to motion. But not entirely. People were still staring. The immigration officer finally straightened, though her expression remained shaken. She carefully handed Ethan's passport back with both hands. Even that simple gesture carried a level of respect that made nearby travelers exchange bewildered glances. "Welcome to Helios Prime, Mr. Walker," she said quietly. Ethan accepted the document and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you." His voice remained calm. Ordinary. The voice of a man asking for directions at a gas station rather than standing at the center of a growing mystery. He picked up his duffel bag and started walking. The crowd parted almost immediately. Not because anyone ordered them to. Not because security demanded it. They simply stepped aside. An invisible corridor opened through the terminal. Ethan hated that. He always hated that. 20 years earlier, nobody would have recognized him. 20 years earlier, he could walk through a station without causing whispers. Now every unfamiliar face seemed to carry a memory that was not his own. As he crossed the polished floor, fragments of conversation drifted through the air. Did she really bow? Who is he? I know that name. No, it cannot be him. My grandfather told stories. Ethan kept moving. The giant observation windows stretched nearly a quarter-mile along the terminal wall. Beyond them, hundreds of ships floated around the orbital station like silver insects around a lantern. Docking lights flashed red, blue, and white against the darkness of space. The gas giant below filled half the sky. Beautiful, peaceful. Ethan paused for a moment to admire it. Then he noticed someone watching him. An elderly alien woman sat alone on a bench near the window. Her gray skin showed the marks of age. Thin silver markings traced her cheeks. A travel cane rested beside her. Most people glanced at Ethan with curiosity. This woman looked at him with something else. Recognition. Her eyes widened. Her hand tightened around the handle of her cane. Ethan immediately looked away. He knew that look. He had seen it too many times. The woman slowly rose to her feet. The movement appeared difficult, yet she stood anyway. "Mr. Walker?" she asked. Her voice barely carried above the noise of the terminal. Ethan stopped walking. Around them, several nearby travelers immediately fell silent. The old woman took another step forward. Tears began forming in the corners of her eyes. Not tears of sadness. Something deeper. Something older. Ethan's shoulders lowered slightly. He already knew what was coming. The woman pressed a trembling hand against her chest. "After all these years," she whispered, "you are real." And suddenly, more people started paying attention. The old woman's words seemed to pull the air out of the terminal. "You are real." The sentence traveled farther than it should have. Nearby travelers stopped pretending not to listen. A pair of cargo pilots lowered their datapads. An alien family standing near the observation windows turned toward Ethan. Even the maintenance drone humming overhead appeared to slow as it followed its programmed route across the ceiling. Ethan shifted the weight of his duffel bag and offered the elderly woman a tired smile. "I assure you, I am very real." A faint laugh escaped her, though tears still glistened in her eyes. "Forgive me," she said. "It is simply difficult to believe." She took another careful step forward. "My grandchildren thought the stories were exaggerated." Ethan glanced toward the floor. Most stories usually are. That answer only seemed to affect her more. Around them, whispers multiplied. Small clusters of travelers began gathering at a distance. Not close enough to appear rude. Close enough to hear. Helios Prime Security noticed the growing crowd almost immediately. Two officers appeared near the entrance to the immigration hall. Their dark uniforms reflected the blue station lights. Both officers activated silent communication links embedded behind their ears. Ethan recognized the behavior. Somewhere deeper inside the station, supervisors were already pulling records, checking databases, confirming identities. The machine of bureaucracy had awakened. He sighed. Again, the elderly woman noticed. "You do not enjoy this attention." "No," Ethan admitted. "Not particularly." She studied him for a moment. "That is why people believe the stories." Before Ethan could respond, a sharp electronic tone echoed through the terminal. Several travelers glanced upward. A priority security channel had activated. More officers entered the hall. Then more. They did not rush. They did not draw attention to themselves. Yet everyone noticed. Security personnel rarely appeared in such numbers unless someone important had arrived. The crowd immediately assumed a government official must be nearby. Then they realized every officer was looking in the same direction. At Ethan Walker, a young merchant standing beside a luggage scanner frowned. "Who is he?" Nobody answered. Not because they did not want to. Because nobody seemed completely certain. They only knew fragments. Rumors. Half-remembered stories told by parents and grandparents. A name attached to impossible acts of kindness. A human who appeared whenever entire worlds had lost hope. A human who always disappeared afterward. The elderly woman slowly straightened her shoulders. "My daughter still keeps your photograph." Ethan blinked. "My photograph?" "The one from the relief convoy." His expression tightened slightly. He remembered the convoy. Barely. There had been thousands of faces. Thousands of names. Most had faded into memory long ago. The woman smiled through her tears. "You carried my son onto the evacuation shuttle when he was sick." Ethan stared at her. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a faint image surfaced. A frightened child wrapped in a thermal blanket. A crowded transport deck. Cold rain against metal hull plating. The memory vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. 20 years was a long time. "Your son?" he asked quietly. The woman nodded. He is a doctor now. The terminal fell silent once more. And for the first time since arriving on Helios Prime, Ethan realized the crowd was no longer growing because of curiosity. They were gathering because they were starting to remember. The atmosphere inside Helios Prime shifted in ways no announcement system could measure. People were no longer arriving and departing. They were stopping, waiting, watching. The giant terminal screens continued displaying schedules in dozens of languages, but fewer travelers seemed interested in their flights. More and more eyes remained fixed on the humans standing beside the observation windows. Ethan Walker looked almost uncomfortable beneath the attention. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and glanced toward the nearest departure gate, as if considering whether he could quietly disappear before the situation grew worse. Deep down, he already knew the answer. It was too late. Across the terminal, information was spreading faster than any official broadcast. A cargo supervisor checked an old database on his wrist display. A university student searched archived historical records. Two elderly travelers exchanged stunned looks after recognizing the same name from completely different worlds. The whispers began connecting together. Small fragments. Half-forgotten memories. Stories passed down across decades. Stories that had never completely vanished. Near the immigration checkpoint, the silver-blue officer who had bowed earlier remained standing. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. She looked less like an employee and more like someone witnessing a piece of history walk through the front door. One of the security supervisors finally approached her. "Officer Tarila," he said quietly. "Is the identification confirmed?" She nodded without hesitation. "Triple verified." The supervisor frowned. "And you are certain?" Tarila slowly turned her screen toward him. His eyes scanned the display. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his posture changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Respect. Genuine respect. He looked toward Ethan. "Stars above," he whispered. Meanwhile, Ethan stood near the enormous glass wall overlooking the docking lanes. Hundreds of ships drifted beyond the transparent alloy. Navigation beacons flashed against the darkness. Service vessels moved between platforms like fireflies crossing a midnight field. It was peaceful. The kind of view he had always enjoyed. The kind of view that reminded him how large the galaxy really was. Behind him, the crowd continued growing. A young alien man finally stepped forward. He could not have been older than 25. "Sir." Ethan looked over. "Yes." The young man hesitated. "My father used to tell me about someone named Walker." Ethan smiled faintly. "There are a lot of Walkers." Several people nearby laughed nervously. The young man did not. "Not this one." Silence returned. The young man swallowed hard. "My father said there was a human who kept showing up whenever entire colonies thought they were finished." Ethan stared at the floor for a moment. "Your father sounds like he enjoyed stories." He was not telling stories. The answer came from somewhere else in the crowd. An older voice. Firm. Certain. Heads turned immediately. An elderly traveler slowly stepped forward from among the gathering passengers. His dark travel cloak carried the dust of long journeys. His eyes never left Ethan. "Because I was there." The terminal became completely silent. Even Ethan looked surprised. The old traveler smiled sadly. "Most people only know the name." He paused. "I remember the day behind it." And for the first time, the mystery surrounding Ethan Walker began moving toward something far more powerful than rumor. It was moving toward memory. The old traveler moved slowly through the crowd, his weathered boots clicking softly against the polished floor. No one interrupted him. No one dared. The gathering passengers seemed to sense that something important was about to be spoken aloud. Ethan remained near the observation window, one hand resting on the strap of his duffel bag. His expression revealed nothing, yet a faint tension settled across his shoulders. He recognized the face. Not the name, not the details, just the face. Another survivor. Another piece of a life he had never expected to follow him across the stars. The elderly traveler stopped several feet away and looked up at Ethan. His eyes reflected the distant docking lights beyond the glass. "You probably do not remember me," he said. Ethan gave a small smile. "I am afraid I do not remember as much as people think I do." A few quiet laughs rippled through the crowd. The old traveler nodded. "That sounds like you." He turned toward the passengers gathered around them. 20 years ago, before most of you had ever heard the name Vesper 9, it was a mining colony on the edge of mapped space. Several listeners exchanged glances. Some recognized the name immediately. Others searched their memory. The old traveler continued. It was not rich. It was not important. Most governments barely knew it existed. His voice remained steady, calm, yet every word seemed to draw the crowd closer. Then one winter, everything started going wrong. Ethan lowered his eyes. He remembered the cold. He remembered endless gray skies and supply shortages. He remembered frightened families pretending everything would be fine. The old traveler pointed toward him. He was not a soldier. He was not a governor. He was not even part of the colony administration. More confused whispers spread through the terminal. The mystery only deepened. If Ethan had not been a military hero, then why did people react to him this way? He flew cargo, the traveler said. Food, medical equipment, water purification systems, whatever people needed. A young student near the front frowned. That is all. The old traveler smiled sadly. That is exactly why people remember him. Silence followed. Beyond the glass, a massive transport vessel slowly detached from its docking berth. Thrusters glowed like distant stars. The old traveler watched it for a moment before speaking again. When conditions became difficult, many organizations withdrew. Many corporations left. Insurance contracts expired. Routes were canceled. The colony became too expensive to support. Several passengers lowered their heads. They already knew where this story was going. Most people accepted that reality. His gaze returned to Ethan. One man did not. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. You are making it sound far more dramatic than it was. The old traveler chuckled. That is because you still do not understand what everyone else saw. Around them, the terminal had become completely silent. No one was looking at schedules anymore. No one cared about delayed departures. They were listening to a memory. A real memory. And for the first time, the legend surrounding Ethan Walker was beginning to take shape not as a tale of power, but as something far rarer. A tale of someone who simply refused to leave when everyone else did. The old traveler drew a slow breath and looked beyond the glass wall as though he could still see the colony from 20 years ago. The lights of Helios Prime reflected across his eyes. Most people remember the ending, he said. Very few remember what those months actually felt like. The crowd listened in complete silence. Even the security officers had stopped pretending to monitor anything else. The old man continued. Every morning, we checked the shipping schedules. Every morning, another route disappeared. Fuel deliveries stopped arriving. Medical inventories shrank. Equipment failures piled up faster than replacement parts could be ordered. Nobody panicked at first. People kept telling themselves things would improve next week. He shook his head gently. Then next week came. Ethan remained quiet. His gaze rested on the stars outside. He remembered those reports. Endless reports. Numbers becoming shortages. Shortages becoming fear. Families began conserving food, the old traveler said. Schools reduced operating hours. Hospitals delayed non-essential procedures. Every conversation started sounding the same. How much longer can we hold on? Several listeners nodded. The story felt uncomfortably familiar. Every civilization had experienced difficult times somewhere in its history. And through all of it, the old traveler said, turning toward Ethan, one cargo pilot kept landing. A murmur spread through the crowd. The old man smiled. Not because he was ordered to. Not because anyone paid him extraordinary amounts of money. He simply kept showing up. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. There were other pilots. Yes, the traveler agreed. For a while, the answer carried more weight than any accusation. More weight than praise. Just truth. Raw and simple. The weather was terrible. The routes were unreliable. Most pilots took safer contracts closer to major systems. He paused. Nobody blamed them. Then his eyes settled on Ethan once more. But every few days, we would hear the engines. A faint smile appeared on several older faces in the crowd. Some of them had heard similar stories before. Children would run to the landing field before the cargo ramp even opened, because they knew supplies had arrived. The old traveler laughed softly. Half the colony thought he carried magic inside those containers. Ethan shook his head. Mostly water filters. Exactly. The old man pointed toward him. That is what made it remarkable. The terminal remained perfectly still. No dramatic battles. No legendary victories. No tales of conquest. Just a human hauling water filters across impossible distances because people needed them. Somehow that made the story feel even larger. Do you know what frightened us most? The traveler asked the crowd. Nobody answered. The possibility that one day he would stop coming. Ethan finally looked up. The old man smiled. Because by then, seeing that ship descend through the clouds meant something. It meant somebody still remembered we existed. Silence settled over the terminal once again. Beyond the observation window, stars drifted across endless darkness. And for the first time, many people in the crowd began to understand why an immigration officer had bowed. Not because Ethan Walker was powerful, not because he was famous, but because somewhere in the past, when an entire colony felt forgotten, he had chosen to remember. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The old traveler's final words lingered beneath the vaulted ceiling of Helios Prime like the fading echo of a distant bell. Ethan wished the conversation would end there. He had never been comfortable carrying other people's memories. Yet the crowd continued growing. Travelers arriving from newly docked ships slowed when they noticed the gathering. Questions spread. Answers followed. Somewhere in the terminal, someone pulled up archived colony records. Somewhere else, an elderly passenger recognized a photograph from decades ago. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Then a sharp voice cut through the silence. That cannot be the entire story. Heads turned. A tall alien male wearing an expensive silver travel coat stepped forward from the crowd. His polished boots reflected the station lights. Several people immediately recognized him as a corporate representative from one of the major trade guilds. He folded his arms. You expect us to believe an entire terminal has stopped because a cargo pilot delivered supplies? A ripple of discomfort passed through the listeners. The question sounded reasonable. On the surface, the old traveler met the man's gaze calmly. No, the representative frowned. Then explain it. Before the traveler could answer, another voice spoke from the crowd. Because he stayed. An elderly woman stepped forward. Then another. Then a middle-aged engineer. Then a gray-haired teacher carrying a worn data tablet. One by one, people emerged from among the passengers. None of them knew each other, yet all wore the same expression. Recognition. The engineer adjusted his glasses. My mother grew up on Vesper 9. The teacher nodded. My grandfather did too. The elderly woman smiled softly. Mine never stopped talking about it. The representative looked around in confusion. You are speaking as though he saved the colony. Ethan finally sighed. Please do not turn this into something bigger than it was. The old traveler laughed quietly. That sentence is exactly why nobody listens when you say it. Several people smiled. The representative did not. Then tell me what happened. The old traveler turned toward the observation window. Beyond the glass, stars burned silently against the darkness. The colony eventually received evacuation authorization. The representative nodded. Good. There was one problem. The crowd grew still. The evacuation ships were not scheduled to arrive for weeks. The representative's confidence faded slightly. The traveler continued. Families still needed food. Hospitals still needed medicine. Children still needed clean water. He pointed toward Ethan. Most shipping companies calculated the risk and left. The representative remained silent. He did not. The teacher folded her arms. For nearly 7 months. The engineer nodded. Route after route. The elderly woman smiled. Trip after trip. Ethan stared out at the stars. 7 months. He had never counted. The representative looked around the crowd and suddenly realized something unsettling. None of these people were repeating rumors. They were repeating family history. Real history. The kind passed from parents to children. The kind that survived because it mattered. And as more passengers gathered around the observation window, the mystery surrounding Ethan Walker finally began changing into something undeniable. Not a legend. Not a myth. A witness remembered by thousands of lives he had touched without ever realizing it. The crowd remained gathered beneath the glow of the terminal lights, caught between disbelief and understanding. The corporate representative had fallen silent. The old traveler had finished speaking, yet nobody seemed ready to leave. It was as though the station itself had paused to listen. Ethan shifted his duffel bag and glanced toward the departure boards again. His shuttle would begin boarding soon. He hoped that would be the end of it. Then he heard footsteps approaching. Soft, careful, familiar. Officer Tarillo walked away from the immigration checkpoint and stopped a few feet in front of him. The silver-blue officer who had bowed earlier no longer looked nervous. She looked determined. Thousands of eyes followed her. Ethan offered a polite smile. You really should get back to work. A faint smile touched her face. I have waited 20 years to say something to you. The line can survive another minute. A few passengers chuckled quietly. Tarila reached into the pocket of her uniform and removed a small object. It was old, worn smooth by time, barely larger than a coin. She held it carefully in her palm. Ethan frowned. What is that? Her eyes glistened. You do not remember, do you? He looked at the object again. Nothing about it seemed familiar. Tarila drew a slow breath. During the evacuation, there was a little girl who would not stop crying. The terminal became silent. Ethan stared at her. Somewhere deep inside his memory, a faint image stirred. A crowded transport terminal. Endless rain. Frightened families carrying everything they owned. A child sitting alone beside a supply crate. Tarila continued. She was 6 years old. Her father had died years earlier. Her mother was sick. She was terrified they would be left behind. Ethan's expression slowly changed. The memory grew clearer. There were thousands of people. Yes. Tarila smiled through gathering tears. But you still noticed one little girl. The crowd listened without moving. Beyond the glass, stars drifted silently across the darkness. Tarila opened her hand. The small object reflected the station lights. A simple metal cargo token. Nothing valuable. Nothing important. Except to her. I was that little girl. The words seemed to stop time itself. Ethan stared at her. For several seconds he could not speak. Tarila laughed softly through her tears. You gave me this token because I was afraid. Her voice trembled. You told me every cargo pilot needed a brave assistant. The memory returned all at once. A frightened child clutching his sleeve. Rain striking the landing pad. A small token pressed into tiny hands. Ethan covered his mouth and looked away. He remembered. Finally, he remembered. You kept it? He asked quietly. Tarila nodded. Every day. Tears slipped down her cheeks. My mother survived. I survived. I grew up. I joined station service. She placed a hand over her heart. Everything I became started on the day a tired cargo pilot stopped long enough to be kind to a scared little girl. No one in the terminal spoke. No one needed to. At that moment they finally understood why she had bowed. Not to a legend. Not to a hero from a history archive. But to the man who had changed her life and never expected to be remembered for it. For several seconds after Tarila finished speaking, the terminal remained completely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of strangers. Not the tense silence of uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that appeared when people suddenly understood something important. Ethan looked at the small cargo token resting in her hand. The edges were worn smooth. Decades of careful handling had polished the metal until it reflected the station lights like silver water. He remembered giving it away. To him, it had been a simple gesture. Something to calm a frightened child. Nothing more. Yet somehow that tiny object had crossed 20 years of history and returned to him. Ethan shook his head slowly. I wish I had something wiser to say. A few people smiled. Tarila laughed softly. You already said it back then. Did I? You told me that brave people are not the ones who are never afraid. Her eyes shined. You said brave people are the ones who keep moving anyway. Ethan stared at the floor. That sounded like something he would say. The crowd stood quietly around them. Travelers. Officers. Workers. Families. Hundreds of lives that had briefly intersected in one corner of a busy station. Then a boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. The calm synthetic voice seemed almost reluctant to interrupt. Final boarding call. Gate 17. Departure in 15 minutes. Ethan glanced toward the illuminated sign above the far corridor. His flight. His shoulders relaxed slightly. That is me. Nobody moved. Tarila carefully closed her fingers around the cargo token. The elderly traveler lowered his head. The old woman near the observation window smiled through tears. One by one, people stepped aside, creating a clear path toward the gate. Not because anyone instructed them to. Not because protocol required it. They simply wanted him to pass. Ethan looked down the corridor, then back at the crowd. Thank you, he said quietly, for remembering. The old traveler shook his head. No. His voice carried clearly across the terminal. Thank you for remembering us first. Ethan did not answer. Some words were too large for conversation. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and began walking. The crowd remained silent as he passed. No applause. No speeches. No ceremony. Only respect. The pure kind. The kind that cannot be ordered and cannot be purchased. Halfway to the gate, Ethan stopped and looked back one final time. Hundreds of faces looked toward him. Tarila stood among them with the cargo token held against her heart. Beyond the enormous observation windows, the stars stretched endlessly across the darkness. Ethan smiled. A small smile. A human smile. Then he turned and continued toward his shuttle. Minutes later, the vessel lifted away from Helios Prime. Its engines glowed softly as it joined the endless stream of ships moving between worlds. Inside the terminal, people slowly returned to their lives. Flights departed. Announcements resumed. Conversations started again. Yet many remained by the observation window long after the shuttle disappeared, watching the stars, thinking, because in a galaxy that admired power, wealth, and status, they had just witnessed something rarer. A man who never sought recognition. A man who never considered himself extraordinary. A man who simply refused to forget people when the rest of the universe did. And perhaps that was why, even after his ship vanished into the darkness, nobody seemed eager to leave. Some legends were remembered because they changed history. Ethan Walker was remembered because he changed lives.